An unexpected call pulls a tycoon from the pinnacle of his empire and plunges him into the drama of a child on the brink of death. While trying to help, he discovers a blood tie hidden beneath layers of power, silence, and abandonment. And in that hospital, amidst life or death decisions, he finds something that money could never buy. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Let's continue. The call came at 10:30 on a rainy Tuesday night in March, when New York City seemed to sigh under the weight of the heavy clouds that were dumping water on the city without end. Richard Henry Castle was in his private office in the penthouse of the Park Avenue Tower, the 42-story skyscraper he himself had commissioned in the heart of the city's most famous avenue. The city lights spread out before the bulletproof window, like a sea of terrestrial stars. But he wasn't even looking outside. His eyes were fixed on his computer screen, analyzing financial reports that would decide the fate of thousands of jobs in Latin America. Richard Henry was known in the business world as the man who never slept. At 53, he had built an empire that spanned from mining to technology, including agribusiness and telecommunications. His grey hair was always impeccably styled, his bespoke suits were cut by the best tailors in Milan, and his icy blue eyes intimidated anyone who dared to contradict him in a meeting. He was a man who lived in numbers, strategies, and decisions that moved billions of dollars as if they were cents. That night, he was reviewing the acquisition proposal for a biotech company in Cambridge when the phone rang. It wasn't the regular phone, the one that sat on his imported mahogany desk and to which only his private secretary and a few top executives had access. It was the domestic line, an old line he had kept only for emergencies from the staff who managed his penthouse. The device was on a side table, almost forgotten among stacks of business magazines he never had time to read. Richard Henry frowned. No one ever called that number. His first impulse was to ignore it. Whoever was calling could wait until the next day or use the proper channels. But the phone kept ringing, persistent, cutting through the silence of the office like a distant siren. Something about the insistence of that ring bothered him. It wasn't normal. In the 20 years he had lived in that penthouse, that phone had rung perhaps 5 times, always for minor issues concerning maintenance or security. With an irritated sigh, he rose from his Italian leather armchair and walked over to the phone. He answered with the firm, dry voice he used when he wanted to make it clear that his patience had its limits. "Hello?" From the other end of the line came a voice he knew, but had never heard in that way. It was a broken, trembling voice, laden with desperation. "Mr. Richard Henry? Sir, please, are you there?" It took him a few seconds to process. It was Constance Smith, the woman who had cleaned his penthouse 3 times a week for over 5 years. A black woman in her early 40s, always discreet, always polite, always efficient. He could barely remember exchanging more than 10 words with her in all that time. Constance arrived, early, did her work in silence, and left, leaving everything impeccably clean and organized. "Constance, what's going on? Why are you calling at this hour?" The response came, punctuated by sobs she tried to contain, but which escaped like waves of pain that could not be held back. "Sir, I didn't know who to call. It's my daughter, sir. My little girl, she's in the hospital. At St. Luke's Hospital on the Upper West Side. She fainted at school this afternoon, and she can't breathe right. The doctors say it's serious, very serious." Richard Henry felt a pang of irritation. Why was she calling him? He wasn't a doctor, not a relative. He had no responsibility for the personal problems of his employees. His first reaction was to tell her she should call a family member or her health insurance, but something in Constance's voice made him hesitate. "Constance, I understand this is a difficult situation, but why are you calling me? Wouldn't it be better to—" "Sir, they need authorization. Authorization from someone responsible. And on the school card, on Isabella's emergency card, the only name I put as a contact was yours." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Richard Henry was speechless. Isabella. That was the name of Constance's daughter. He knew she had a daughter because sometimes Constance asked to leave early to pick her up from school, but he had never given it much thought. It was just another irrelevant piece of information in his organized, compartmentalized life. "What do you mean, Constance? Why did you put my name?" Her voice became more fragile, almost inaudible. "Sir, I don't have any family here in New York. I came from Pennsylvania 7 years ago after my husband died. I don't have siblings. My parents aren't alive. It's just me and Isabella. And when the school asked for an emergency contact, I thought you were... that if something happened..." She couldn't finish the sentence. The crying took over, and Richard Henry heard the sobs from the other end of the line, like echoes of a desperation he had never experienced in his protected, shielded life. "Constance, where are you now?" I'm here at the hospital, sir. But they won't let me stay with her. They say they need authorization from someone responsible to do the tests, and that if she gets worse, they need consent for more invasive procedures. And I don't know what to do, sir. I don't know where to turn." Richard Henry looked around his office, the walls lined with fine wood, the paintings by famous artists, the business trophies gleaming under the soft light of imported lamps. All of it suddenly seemed insignificant in the face of the desperate voice of a mother who didn't know how to save her daughter. "Are the doctors there now? Can you put one of them on?" "Yes, sir. Let me get the doctor." He heard hurried footsteps, distant voices, and then a masculine voice, professional and tired. "Good evening, this is Dr. Marcus Ventura from the pediatric emergency room. Are you the legal guardian of the minor, Isabella Smith?" Richard Henry took a deep breath. He was about to take on a responsibility he didn't fully understand, for a child he barely knew in a situation completely beyond his control. But something in Constance's broken voice had touched a part of him that had lain dormant for decades. "Yes, doctor. I am Richard Henry Castle. I'm on my way there now. Do whatever is necessary to stabilize the child. I assume all legal and financial responsibility. Mr. Castle, it would be important for you to come as quickly as possible. The child's condition is delicate and we need some urgent authorizations. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Richard Henry hung up the phone and stood still for a few seconds, trying to process what he had just done. He, who planned every move of his life with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker, had just made a completely impulsive decision. He was about to leave his protected penthouse in the middle of the night to go to a hospital to care for a child he didn't know. He grabbed the key to his car, a black Porsche Panamera, and left the penthouse without even turning off his computer. As he descended in the private elevator, he tried to understand what he was feeling. It was a strange mix of anxiety and curiosity, seasoned with a hint of fear he couldn't explain. During the drive through the empty streets of New York, with the windshield wipers battling the persistent rain, Richard Henry found himself thinking about Constance. How had she reached the point of putting him as an emergency contact for her daughter? What kind of loneliness was that made a woman trust an employer who barely spoke to her? St. Luke's Hospital rose before him like a white fortress silhouetted against the dark sky. He parked in an emergency spot, not caring about the rules or the fines. For the first time in many years, something was more important than protocols and regulations. The pediatric emergency reception was a sterile and cold environment, lit by fluorescent lamps that gave everyone a sickly yellowish hue. Constance was sitting in a blue plastic chair, clutching a crumpled piece of paper in her trembling hands. When she saw him, her eyes filled with tears of relief. "Mr. Richard Henry, you came. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so, so much." She stood up as if to kneel, but he stopped her with a gesture. "How is she, Constance?" "The doctors are running some tests. They say it's her lungs, that she can't breathe properly, but they won't explain anything properly because they say I'm not, that they need a responsible party." At that moment, Dr. Marcus Ventura approached. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair and deep, dark circles under his eyes that betrayed sleepless nights. "Mr. Castle, I'm Dr. Ventura. Can we speak in private?" Richard Henry looked at Constance, who was watching him with pleading eyes. "Constance is coming with us. She's the child's mother." The doctor hesitated for a moment but eventually agreed. They walked down a long corridor that smelled of disinfectant and fear until they reached a small room with just a table, and a few uncomfortable chairs. "Mr. Castle, the child's condition is worrying. She arrived here with a severe respiratory crisis, and our team managed to stabilize her temporarily, but we suspect it's more than just a simple asthma attack. Initial tests point to a possible compromise of her immune system." Constance brought a hand to her mouth, stifling a gasp of despair. "What does that mean, Doctor?" Richard Henry asked. "It means we need to run a battery of more complex tests to determine the extent of the problem, tests that require express authorization from a legal guardian and which are quite invasive. We also need authorization for emergency procedures in case we need to intubate the child or perform a more aggressive intervention. Do whatever is necessary. Sir, these tests are expensive. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars." Richard Henry took his wallet from the inside pocket of his jacket and handed a black credit card to the doctor. "Use this card. There is no limit, and I want her to have the best possible care. If you need to transfer her to an even better hospital, do it. If you need specialists from other countries, hire them. I want everything." Dr. Ventura seemed surprised by the determination in the businessman's voice. "Very well, sir. We will begin the tests immediately. You can wait in the pediatric ICU waiting room, and there's one more thing." "Go on." "The child is asking for her mother. She's conscious but very scared. It might be important for you to be near her during the procedures." Constance looked at Richard Henry with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "Of course she can stay. And doctor, I want complete medical reports every 2 hours. I want to know exactly what is happening." As they walked back down the corridor, Richard Henry felt he was entering completely unknown territory. He was a man who controlled destinies, who moved markets, who made decisions. That affected the lives of thousands of people. But there, in that hospital, faced with the suffering of a child and the desperation of a mother, he felt small and vulnerable. They reached the pediatric ICU, an even more sterile environment than the emergency room. Through a glass wall he could see Isabella for the first time. She was a small girl for her 9 years, with dark, curly hair spread over the white pillow. Her face had the greyish colour of someone struggling to breathe, and several wires connected her tiny body to machines that blinked and emitted constant, hypnotic sounds. Constance pressed her hand against the glass, tears streaming silently down her face. "My girl, my little Isabella." Richard Henry stood beside her, watching the child. There was something about the scene that disturbed him deeply. It wasn't just the girl's obvious fragility or the mother's desperation. It was the feeling that he was facing something truly important for the first time in many years. Something that couldn't be solved with money, influence, or power. A nurse approached and said that Constance could go in, but that only one person at a time was allowed in the room. Richard Henry gestured for her to go. "Go be with her. I'll stay out here." "Sir, I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me for anything, Constance. Take care of your daughter." As Constance entered the ICU, Richard Henry sat in one of the uncomfortable chairs in the waiting room. It was almost midnight, and the hospital had taken on that strange quietness that only places that never completely sleep can have. He could hear the distant murmur of conversations between doctors, the constant hum of the machines, and the sound of hurried footsteps echoing down the corridors. For the first time in decades, Richard Henry Castle didn't know what to do. There was no business plan for this situation, no strategy that could be applied, no procedure manual that explained how a businessman should behave when he finds himself responsible for the life of an unknown child. He looked at his cell phone and saw 17 missed calls from his aides, probably worried about his sudden absence from an important meeting scheduled for 11 o'clock. For a moment, he thought about returning the calls, explaining that urgent problems had arisen, delegating the situation to someone on his team and returning to his orderly, predictable life. But then he heard Constance's voice coming from the ICU room, speaking softly to her daughter. "Mommy's here, my love. Mommy's not leaving. And there's a very good man who's helping us, a man who came here just to take care of you." Richard Henry turned off his phone without returning any calls. For the first time in many years, something was more important than his business. The next 2 hours dragged on like centuries. Richard Henry had sent his private driver, Sebastian, to get coffee and sandwiches from the nearest bakery. That was still open, but neither he nor Constance could eat anything. The woman went in and out of the ICU room as the doctors allowed, while he remained in the waiting room, observing the nocturnal movements of the hospital. It was a world completely different from the one he lived in. Here people didn't wear expensive suits or carry Italian leather briefcases. They were ordinary men and women, some still in pajamas, others in wrinkled clothes hastily put on, all united by the same anguish that knew no social differences. It was the first time Richard Henry felt part of something bigger than his own ambitions. Around 2 in the morning, Dr. Ventura appeared with a folder full of papers and a grave expression he couldn't hide behind his professional mask. "Mr. Castle, can we talk?" Constance came out of the room at that moment, her eyes red from crying, but with an iron determination that was impressive. She was a woman who had learned to be strong because she had no choice. "How is she, doctor?" Richard Henry asked. "Stabilized for now. We've managed to improve her respiratory function a bit, but the initial tests have confirmed our suspicions. Isabella's immune system is severely compromised. We suspect a rare genetic condition, but we need more specific tests to confirm." "What kind of condition?" Constance asked, her voice trembling. "All indications point to a primary immunodeficiency. Her body doesn't produce the necessary defenses to fight infections and other health problems. That's why a simple asthma attack turned into something so serious." Richard Henry felt a weight in his chest. He knew that rare genetic conditions usually meant complex, expensive, and not always effective treatments. What needs to be done? First, a battery of genetic tests that can only be performed in New York at 2 specialized labs. Then, depending on the results, a very specific treatment might be necessary. We're talking about something that could require months of intensive care. And without treatment. The doctor hesitated, looking at Constance. Without treatment, any simple infection could be fatal. The silence that followed was broken only by the constant sounds of the machines and the distant noise of a siren in the street. Constance leaned against the wall as if her legs could no longer bear the weight of that reality. "Doctor, arrange for all the necessary tests, and if we need to bring in specialists from other countries, bring them. I want her to have the best possible chance." "Mr. Castle, there's an issue. For some of these tests, we need the biological mother's presence. There are legal consent issues that—" "Constance is here, she's the mother." "Yes, but you signed as the temporary legal guardian. In some specific situations, especially when it comes to genetic testing, the law requires the presence and consent of the biological mother registered on the documents. It's a legal protection for complex cases like this." Richard Henry looked at Constance, who seemed confused by all the legal discussion. "Constance, do you have all of Isabella's documents?" "Yes, sir, they're all at home. Birth certificate, vaccination card, everything." "Good. Sebastian can go get them. Where do you live?" "In the Bronx, sir." "But—" She hesitated, looking embarrassed. "It's far, sir. And I don't know if it's a place that—" "Constance, that doesn't matter right now. What matters is your daughter. Sebastian will get the documents." Richard Henry called his driver and gave him precise instructions. Meanwhile, Dr. Ventura explained the procedures that would be carried out in the next few hours. They were complex. Tests that would involve genetic analysis, immunological tests, and a pulmonary function evaluation. "One thing worries me, doctor," said Richard Henry. "How did a child with such a serious condition go 9 years without a proper diagnosis?" The doctor sighed, as if the question touched a sore spot. "Unfortunately, Mr. Castle, the reality of the American healthcare system is that rare conditions often go unnoticed, especially in lower-income families. The symptoms can be confused with common asthma, allergies, or other more common illnesses. A specific set of tests is required, which aren't always ordered in routine checkups." "Constance, had Isabella shown health problems before?" "Yes, sir. Since she was little, she had a lot of colds, a lot of flu. The doctors at the clinic always said it was allergies, that it was just a kid thing. They'd give her allergy medicine and send us home, but she would get sick again very quickly." "And you never sought a second opinion?" Constance lowered her eyes, clearly embarrassed. "Sir, the health plan I have is basic. Appointments with specialists take months to schedule, and when you finally get one, the doctor takes a quick look and says it's normal. I always just thought it was a mother's worry." Richard Henry felt a pang of something he couldn't quite define. It was a mixture of indignation and guilt. Indignation because a child had gone years without a proper diagnosis due to limitations in the healthcare system, and guilt because he, who had the resources to solve any medical problem, had never realized that people so close to him lived in a completely different reality. "From now on, that's going to change," he said, more to himself than to the others. Around 4 in the morning, Sebastian returned with a plastic bag containing all of Isabella's documents. Richard Henry took the opportunity to discreetly glance at the girl's birth certificate, while Constance organized the papers to hand them over to the hospital. Child's name, Isabella Smith Oliver. Mother, Constance Marie Smith. Father, Joseph Charles Oliver. The father's name was there, officially registered, but Constance had mentioned that he had died. There was something about that certificate that caught Richard Henry's attention, but he couldn't identify what it was at first glance. "Constance, you said your husband died 7 years ago?" "That's right, sir. Joseph Charles. He had a heart problem. Very young, only 32. It was all very fast." "Were you married for a long time?" "We met in Scranton, sir, a small city in Pennsylvania. I worked as a nurse's aide at the local health clinic, and he was a mechanic. We got married and were together for 5 years. When he died, I didn't know what to do. I had no family, no good job. Then a cousin of mine who lived here in New York said there was cleaning work, that I could try to make a life in the city." "And you brought Isabella by yourself?" "I did, sir. She was 2 years old. It was very hard at first. We lived in a boarding house in the South Bronx for almost 2 years, until I could save enough money to rent a small room in Morrisania." Richard Henry listened to the story, trying to imagine what it would be like to leave everything behind and start over in a gigantic city with a small child in tow. It was a reality so distant from his own that it seemed almost unreal. At that moment, a nurse approached with information about the tests. Some results were already in, and Dr. Ventura wanted to speak with them. Back in the private room, the doctor opened an envelope with some reports. "The preliminary tests have confirmed our suspicion. Isabella has a severe immunodeficiency. Specifically, it appears to be a condition called SCID, severe combined immunodeficiency. It's a very rare genetic disease." "What does that mean exactly?" Richard Henry asked. "It means her immune system doesn't function properly. She's vulnerable to any type of infection, no matter how minor. It's a condition that usually manifests in the first few months of life, but in some cases, it can go unnoticed for years if the child is very protected or lucky with infections." "And what's the treatment?" Dr. Ventura hesitated again, and Richard Henry realized that the doctor's hesitations never brought good news. "The ideal treatment for SCID is a bone marrow transplant. It's a complex, expensive procedure that requires a compatible donor." "What do you mean, a compatible donor?" "Someone whose blood and bone marrow are genetically compatible with Isabella's. Usually they are close relatives, parents, siblings, first cousins. Compatibility between unrelated people is extremely rare." Constance, who had remained silent throughout the technical explanation, finally spoke. "Doctor, can I be a donor? I'm her mother. We'll test you, of course, but there's a possibility that you are only a carrier of the genetic condition, not necessarily compatible for a transplant. We'll need to test all close family members." "Doctor," said Richard Henry, "what family members? Constance told me she has no family here in New York." "Any first-degree relative can be tested. Parents, siblings, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. The closer the genetic relationship, the greater the chance of compatibility. The child's father's family, are they still in Pennsylvania?" Constance shook her head. "Joseph Charles was an orphan, sir. He never knew. His father and his mother died when he was a teenager. He was raised by an aunt, but she has also passed away." "Siblings?" "He had no siblings. He was an only child." Dr. Ventura closed the folder with the test results. "Well, we'll start by testing the mother. If there's no match, we can expand the search or look in the National Bone Marrow Donor Registry. But I have to be honest, the chance of finding a compatible donor in the National Registry for a child with this specific condition is very low. How much time do we have? How much time do Richard Henry asked. With the right medication and care, we can keep Isabella stable for a few weeks, maybe months. But the longer we wait for the transplant, the greater the risk of an opportunistic infection that could be fatal. Constance let out a muffled sob and leaned back in her chair. The reality was becoming increasingly heavy and frightening. "Doctor, test my blood too," Richard Henry said suddenly. Everyone looked at him in surprise. "Sir?" "Test my blood for compatibility. I know the chances are minimal between unrelated people, but I want you to test it anyway." "Mr. Castle, with all due respect, the chance of compatibility between you and Isabella is astronomically small. It would be a waste of time and resources." "Doctor, I didn't ask about the chances. I said to test my blood. I can pay for the tests." The doctor seemed confused by his insistence, but eventually agreed. "Very well, sir. We'll collect blood samples from you and Constance later today. The compatibility results could take a few days." While they waited for the nurse to come and collect the blood, Richard Henry went back to watching Isabella through the ICU glass. The girl was awake now, talking softly with Constance, who had returned to the room. Even from a distance he could see she was a beautiful child, with large, expressive eyes that seemed very mature for her age. It was then that something bothered him again. There was something familiar about that face, something he couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was just an impression caused by the emotional situation, but he had the strange feeling that he had seen those eyes somewhere before. When the nurse came to collect the blood samples, Richard Henry took the opportunity to ask about the next steps. "Nurse, how long does the compatibility test result take?" "For the basic test, 48 hours. For full confirmation, up to a week." "And if there's a match?" "Then we need to do more specific tests on the potential donor to ensure they are fit for the procedure." After they gave blood, Constance went back to stay with Isabella, and Richard Henry found himself alone in the waiting room once again. It was almost 5 in the morning, and he could see through the window that the day was beginning to break over New York. The rain had stopped, and the city was starting to wake up for another day of hustle and commitments. He picked up his cell phone and saw 43 missed calls. His schedule for the next day, or rather for that day, was completely compromised. He had a meeting with Japanese investors at 9 in the morning, a video conference with the Miami branch at noon, and a business dinner with senators in Washington, D.C. in the evening. All of it seemed to belong to another life, to another man. He called Valerie, his personal assistant, who was surely already up and preparing for another day of work. "Mr. Castle, thank God, we were all worried. Are you all right? Did something happen?" "Valerie, cancel all my appointments for today." "What do you mean, sir? We have the meeting with the Japanese investors who came especially to—" "Cancel everything, Valerie. Reschedule for next week. And if anyone asks where I am, tell them a family emergency came up." "A family emergency, sir?" "But—" "That's right, Valerie. A family emergency." He hung up before she could ask any more questions. For the first time in his career, Richard Henry Castle had put something personal ahead of business. And strangely, instead of feeling guilty or anxious, he felt a kind of relief he hadn't experienced in years. He went back to watching Constance through the glass. She was sitting next to Isabella's bed, holding her daughter's small hand and humming some song he couldn't identify. It was a scene of tenderness and unconditional love that moved him in a way he hadn't expected. It was in that moment that Richard Henry realized that at 53 years old, for the first time in his life, he was doing something truly important. Not important for his shareholders, not important for the economy or for his company's profits. Important for two people who truly needed him. And that feeling, he discovered, was much better than any business victory he had ever experienced. The dawn brought a different kind of activity to the hospital. The night shift teams began to be replaced by the day staff, and corridors that were once silent now echoed with conversations, hurried footsteps, and the constant noise of equipment being moved from one place to another. Richard Henry had dozed for a few hours in the uncomfortable waiting room chair, but he woke with every movement from constance or change, in the rhythm of the machines monitoring Isabella. Around 7 in the morning, Dr. Ventura was replaced by Dr. Frank Aguilar, a pediatrician specializing in immunology who took over the case. He was a younger man, perhaps in his 40s, with a more direct way of speaking, that Richard Henry found refreshing after a night of hesitations and half-truths. "Mr. Castle, I reviewed all of the child's tests during the night. The diagnosis is confirmed. Severe SCID. We'll need to transfer her to a specialized unit as soon as she's stable enough for transport." "Transfer her where?" "Mount Sinai or Columbia University Irving Medical Center. Both have specialized units for treating primary immunodeficiencies. I recommend Mount Sinai for its facilities and experience with transplants." "Then arrange the transfer to Mount Sinai. Today, if possible." "Sir, I'll be direct. Her treatment at Mount Sinai will cost several $1,000,000. It's important that you're clear about that." Richard Henry almost smiled at the doctor's concern. A few $1,000,000 was what he made in a week of operations on the stock market. "Dr. Aguilar, don't worry about the costs. I want her to have the best possible treatment regardless of the price." The doctor seemed relieved, but still had a worried expression. "There's another problem. For the transfer and the start of the transplant protocol, we need the mother to be present and available for every step. There are many authorizations, many procedures that require her presence. Constance is here. What's the problem?" "It's just that, well, we tried to contact her several times during the night to clarify some bureaucratic issues, but she's not answering her cell phone." Richard Henry frowned. "What do you mean she's in there with her daughter?" "No, sir. She left around 5 this morning. She said she had to deal with an emergency and would be back soon." A strange feeling washed over Richard Henry. Constance had left the hospital without telling him, at the very moment her presence was most needed. It didn't make sense. "Did she say what this emergency was?" "No, sir, just that she'd be back soon." Richard Henry took out his cell phone and called Constance's number. The call went straight to voicemail. He tried 2 more times with the same result. This was very strange. "Doctor, can you transfer Isabella without her mother present?" "Temporarily, yes, since you've assumed legal responsibility. But to begin the transplant procedures, the mother's presence is mandatory. Then make the transfer. I'll take responsibility for finding Constance." While the preparations for Isabella's transfer were being made, Richard Henry called Sebastian. "Sebastian, I need you to go to the Bronx to Constance's address. She might have gone home for some emergency." "Yes, sir, but do you have the exact address?" Richard Henry realized he didn't know exactly where Constance lived. He knew it was in the Bronx, but he didn't have the full address. "Hold on, Sebastian, let me see if I can find out." He went to the hospital reception and explained the situation. The clerk consulted the system and provided the address on file: 247 Palm Tree Street, apartment 23, the Bronx. "Sebastian, 247 Palm Tree Street, apartment 23, in the Bronx. If she's there, bring her back immediately. If she's not, try talking to neighbors, anything that might help locate her." 2 hours later, Sebastian called with disturbing news. "Mr. Castle, I'm at the address. Constance isn't home. I spoke with a neighbor, a Mrs. Francis, who lives in the apartment next door. She said she saw Constance leaving the house very early, around 4 in the morning with a bag in her hands." "Anything else?" "Yes, sir. The neighbor said it seemed strange because Constance was a bit nervous, looking around as if she were afraid of something." Richard Henry felt a knot in his stomach. Something was very wrong with this story. "Sebastian, come back to the hospital. We'll call the police if necessary." "Sir, there's one more thing. Mrs. Francis said that yesterday afternoon, before Constance left for the hospital, 2 people came here asking for her. A man and a woman in suits. They looked like officials." "Officials? What kind of officials?" The neighbor couldn't say, but she said they left when they found out Constance wasn't there. Richard Henry hung up the phone with a growing sense of alarm. He decided to use his corporate resources to investigate the situation. He called Carlos Mendoza, the director of security for his companies, a former federal agent who had contacts in all spheres of public safety. "Carlos, I need your help locating someone, urgently." "Of course, Mr. Castle. What do you need?" Constance Marie Smith, Social Security number. He consulted the documents still in his possession. 111-22-33. 3. She disappeared this morning and I need to find her urgently. Can you give me more details? Richard Henry quickly explained the situation, from the early morning call to Constance's sudden disappearance. Carlos listened attentively and promised to mobilize his contacts immediately. Mr. Castle, I'll check police systems to see if there's any recent record related to her. If she's involved in any legal situation, my contacts will find out quickly. Carlos, be discreet, but be fast. Her daughter needs her mother present to authorize urgent medical treatment. Understood, sir. While waiting for news, Richard Henry accompanied Isabella's transfer to Mount Sinai Hospital. The girl was conscious during the transfer and asked for her mother several times. He didn't know what to answer, so he just said that Constance would be back soon. At Mount Sinai, Isabella was placed in a special ICU for immunocompromised patients, an almost sterile environment where anyone entering had to wear special gowns and masks. The facility was impressive. Individual rooms with air purification systems, state-of-the-art technology, and a highly specialized medical team. Dr. Robert Steinberg, head of the transplant unit, personally took over Isabella's case. He was a man of about 60, with an international reputation in bone marrow transplants. Mr. Castle, I've reviewed the child's entire medical history. Her case is complex but not hopeless. If we can find a compatible donor, the chances of success are good. The compatibility tests we did last night, when will the results be in? We should have the first results this afternoon, but I have to warn you, the chance of compatibility between people without close kinship is less than 1%. And if the mother isn't compatible? Then we'll need to search the National Bone Marrow Donor Registry or expand the search to more distant relatives. It was at that moment that Richard Henry's cell phone rang. It was Carlos. Mr. Castle, I've found Constance Smith. Where is she? At the precinct in the Morrisania neighborhood. She was arrested last night for theft. Richard Henry felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. What do you mean, theft? According to the police report, she was detained at a supermarket in the area around 9 o'clock last night. She tried to leave with unpaid items hidden in her purse. What items? Food and, here it is, a box of disposable syringes. Suddenly, everything started to make sense in Richard Henry's mind. Constance hadn't called him because she wanted to. She had been arrested and used her one permitted call to phone the only number she knew of someone who could help. Her boss. Carlos, where is she exactly? The Morrisania precinct. She spent the night in a cell and should have a bail hearing this afternoon. Syringes. She stole syringes. Probably for her daughter. It's possible, sir. The theft was of basic necessities and basic medical supplies. Richard Henry felt devastated. Constance had spent years working for him honestly, and she had reached the point of trying to steal food and syringes out of desperation. While he was accumulating millions, his employee didn't even have money to buy the basics for her sick daughter. Carlos, I want her released immediately. Use all necessary contacts. Sir, it's not that simple. She's already been charged. She's in the system. We have to follow the legal process. Then hire the best criminal defense lawyers in New York. I want her released today. I'll arrange it immediately. After the call, Richard Henry stood alone in the hospital corridor, trying to process everything he had discovered. Constance had spent the night in jail while he was sleeping in the hospital waiting room. She had been arrested trying to steal basic things for her daughter while he was signing authorizations for treatments that cost millions. He went to Isabella's room, who was awake and looking a little better with the new treatment. "Where's Mommy?" she asked with a weak voice. She had to take care of something important, but she'll be back soon, Richard Henry lied, feeling terrible for not being able to tell the truth. Are you Mommy's friend? I am. She always says she works for a very important man. Is that you? It is. You're nice. Mommy said you were going to help me get better. Richard Henry felt a lump in his throat. The child's trust in his words was both moving and frightening. We are, Isabella. You're going to get well. Around 2 in the afternoon, Richard Henry received 2 important calls. The first was from Carlos, confirming that the lawyers were already working on Constance's case and that she should be released later that day. The second was from the lab with the first results of the compatibility tests. Dr. Steinberg called him for a private conversation. "Mr. Castle, the results are in. Constance Smith is not a compatible bone marrow donor for her daughter." "And me?" "That's the interesting part. We asked the lab to confirm the result 3 times because they believed there was an error. Mr. Castle, you are a match for Isabella Smith." Richard Henry was silent for a few seconds. "How is that possible? I have no relation to her." "That's the thing, sir. A bone marrow match of this degree only occurs between very close relatives. We're talking about a chance of less than 1 in 10 million between unrelated people." "What exactly does that mean?" "It means that genetically there is a strong possibility of a family relationship between you and Isabella, perhaps a relationship you're unaware of." Richard Henry felt the ground shift beneath his feet. A relationship he was unaware of? How could that be possible? "Doctor, what kind of relationship would generate this compatibility? Parents and children have a 50% chance of being a match. Siblings have a 25% chance. Grandparents, grandchildren, uncles and nieces, nephews have between 10 and 15%. First cousins have about a 5% chance. And the match you found? 92%. That's typical of a first or second degree relative." Richard Henry sat down heavily in the chair. His mind was trying to process information that made no sense. "Doctor, is it possible that she's my daughter?" "Theoretically, yes, but a paternity test would be needed to confirm." Richard Henry's mind raced back to the past. 9 years ago, he was married to Helena, his ex-wife. There was no way Isabella could be his daughter. Or was there? "Doctor, can you run a paternity test discreetly?" "Of course. With a blood sample from both of you, we can have a result in 48 hours. Do the test, but for now, this stays between us." While the hospital organized the additional tests, Richard Henry was confronted with a possibility he had never considered. Could Constance be more than just his employee? He tried to remember any moment he might have had a relationship with her, but he couldn't. Constance had worked for him for 5 years. Isabella was 9. The timeline didn't add up. Then he remembered the name on the birth certificate, Joseph Charles Oliver, the girl's father. Perhaps the connection wasn't with Constance, but with her late husband. Around 5 in the afternoon, Carlos called with the news that Constance had been released. She was on her way to the hospital, accompanied by one of the lawyers he had hired. "Carlos, I need you to investigate something for me. Joseph Charles Oliver died 7 years ago in Scranton, Pennsylvania. I want to know everything about his family." "What specific information?" "Mainly about his father. Constance said he was fatherless, but I need to be sure." "I'll look into it, sir." An hour later, Constance arrived at the hospital accompanied by Dr. Mark Viana, one of the most respected criminal defense lawyers in New York. She was visibly shaken, her eyes swollen from crying and a look of deep humiliation on her face. When she saw Richard Henry, she couldn't hold back her tears. "Sir, I don't know what to say. You must think I'm a thief, that—" "Constance, stop it. You don't need to explain yourself." "But I have to, sir. You have to understand that I've never done this in my life. Never. But when Isabella started getting sick in the morning, I saw I didn't even have money to buy the syringes the clinic doctor said might help her breathe better, and the food at home was gone, and I didn't know if I'd have money to buy more until payday." She spoke between sobs, as if the words were hard to get out. "I went to the supermarket just to look at prices, to see if I could afford something cheap. But when I saw the syringes there and the food, I thought of my daughter going hungry and without her medicine. I don't know what came over me, sir. I've never done that in my life." Richard Henry approached her, and for the first time since he had known her, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Constance, that doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that you're here, and Isabella needs you. Let's forget about this and focus on what's important." "How is she, sir? The doctors wouldn't let me see her before they took me to the station." "She's better. We've transferred her here, and she's getting the best possible treatment. But the doctors need to talk to you about some important things." Constance went to Isabella's room, who was sleeping under the effect of light sedatives. Through the glass, mother and daughter looked at each other, and even with all the equipment and masks, it was possible to see the relief on the child's face when she saw her mother had returned. Later, Dr. Steinberg spoke with Constance about the diagnosis and treatment options. When he got to the topic of the bone marrow transplant, he explained that she was not a match, but that they had found a compatible donor. "Doctor, who is the donor?" Constance asked. Dr. Steinberg looked at Richard Henry, who gave a discreet signal not to mention the results of the additional tests yet. "It's a volunteer donor who offered to help," the doctor said. "We're going to run some additional tests to confirm full compatibility, but the chances are very good." Constance turned to Richard Henry with an expression of disbelief. "Sir, don't tell me that you—" "Constance, let's wait for all the test results before we talk about it. The important thing is that we have a real chance to cure Isabella." That night, while Constance slept in an armchair next to her daughter's bed, Richard Henry remained at the hospital, awaiting the results of the tests that could completely change his understanding of who Isabella Smith was and what his true connection to this family was. The dawn of the second day at Mount Sinai Hospital arrived with a mixture of hope and anxiety that hung over everyone involved. Richard Henry had spent another night in the waiting room, refusing to go home until the test results arrived. Constance had slept beside her daughter, waking every hour to check if Isabella was okay. During the night, the girl's health had stabilized significantly. The specialized medications were controlling her respiratory symptoms, and for the first time since she had arrived at the hospital, she managed to sleep for a few consecutive hours without apparent discomfort. However, everyone knew this was only a temporary relief. Without the bone marrow transplant, any simple infection could be fatal. Around 8 in the morning, Carlos called Richard Henry with the results of his investigation into Joseph Charles Oliver. "Mr. Castle, I've managed to find some interesting information about Constance's late husband." "What did you discover?" "Joseph Charles Oliver was born in 1979 in Scranton, Pennsylvania. His mother was registered as Mary Ann Oliver, single. In the father field, it was written father unknown." Constance was right then. He really didn't know his father. "Here's the interesting part, sir. I managed to speak with some older people from Scranton who knew the family. Mary Ann worked for years as a domestic helper for several families in the area. Between 1978 and 1979, she worked for a family of entrepreneurs who had business in New York." Richard Henry felt a chill run down his spine. "What family, Carlos?" "I only got the initial surname. It was a family named Castle. They had a cattle ranch in a town near Scranton and would stay there for seasons." The world stopped around. Richard Henry. Castle. His own family. His mind immediately raced to his grandfather, Henry Castle, who had passed away when he was 15. His grandfather did indeed have rural properties in Pennsylvania in the 1970s. "Carlos, are you sure about the name?" "Absolutely, sir, and there's more. According to the people I spoke with, Mary Ann's employer at the time was a very religious lady, but the husband, well, he had a reputation as a womanizer. They say he harassed the maids, to use their words." Richard Henry closed his eyes. His grandmother Isabel, after whom Isabella Smith had likely been named, was indeed a very religious woman, and his grandfather, well, there had always been whispers in the family about his extramarital affairs. "Carlos, I need you to dig deeper. I want to know exactly when and where this woman worked for the Castle family." "I'm already on it, sir, but I can tell you one thing. Mary Ann left her job in February 1979, pregnant. Joseph Charles was born in October of that year." The dates lined up perfectly. If Richard Henry's grandfather was indeed the father of Joseph Charles, that would make Isabella his first cousin, and that would completely explain the bone marrow compatibility that the doctors had considered impossible. At that moment, Dr. Steinberg approached with a folder in his hands and a serious expression on his face. "Mr. Castle, can we talk?" "Of course, doctor." They went to a private room where the doctor opened the folder with several reports. "Mr. Castle, The results of the supplementary tests are in. The paternity test was negative. You are not the father of Isabella Smith. Richard Henry felt a mix of relief and confusion. Then how do you explain the genetic compatibility? We ran more comprehensive tests. The results indicate that there is indeed a family relationship between you and the girl, but not in a direct line. Based on the genetic pattern we found, it all points to you being first cousins. First cousins? How would that be possible? It means that one of the parents of one of you is a sibling to one of the parents of the other, or that you share a common grandfather. Richard Henry felt as if the pieces of a complex puzzle were finally falling into place. Doctor, based on the genetic results, what would be the most likely hypothesis? Considering the ages and the pattern of genetic markers, the most likely hypothesis is that one's grandfather is the father of the other's father. In this case, that you share a paternal grandfather. Richard Henry took a deep breath. Everything was being confirmed. His grandfather, Henry Castle, was indeed the father of Joseph Charles Oliver. Isabella was his first cousin. Doctor, does this change anything regarding the transplant? On the contrary, it confirms that you are an ideal donor. With this degree of kinship and the compatibility we found, the chances of a successful transplant are over 80%. When can we do the surgery? We need to prepare you for the donation. There are preoperative exams, a cardiological evaluation, analysis of your bone marrow. If all goes well, we can do the procedure next week. After the conversation with the doctor, Richard Henry was alone for a few minutes, trying to process everything he had discovered. He had a cousin, a 9-year-old cousin who was fighting for her life. And not only that, he had a cousin who was the daughter of the woman who had been cleaning his house for 5 years, and he never knew. He decided he needed to talk to Constance about all of this. She deserved to know the truth about the connection between their families. He found her in Isabella's room, talking softly with her daughter, who was awake and looking much better. "Constance, can we talk?" "Of course, sir." They went out into the hallway, where Richard Henry tried to find the right words to explain such a complex situation. "Constance, do you remember telling me that Joseph Charles was fatherless?" "Yes, sir, he never knew his father." "Do you know where his mother worked around the time he was conceived?" Constance seemed surprised by the question. "Sir, why are you asking this?" "Constance, the medical tests revealed something surprising. There is a family relationship between me and Isabella. We are first cousins." Constance's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, a slow, frightened understanding. "How is that possible?" "My security team investigated Joseph Charles's family. His mother, Mary Ann, worked as a domestic helper for my family in Pennsylvania in 1978 and 1979, specifically for my grandfather, Henry Castle." Constance brought a hand to her mouth. "Are you saying that all indications are that my grandfather is Joseph Charles's father? That makes you my cousin by marriage and Isabella my first cousin." Constance leaned against the wall, trying to absorb the information. "Oh my God, Joseph Charles always said he wanted to know his father. He always said he felt like he had family somewhere. And he did. He had family. And now you and Isabella do too." Tears began to stream down Constance's face. "Sir, does this mean—" "It means you're not alone, Constance. You will never be alone again. And it also means I can donate bone marrow to Isabella with a much greater chance of success." Constance began to cry, but they were not tears of sadness. It was a mixture of relief, gratitude, and an emotion she couldn't define. "I always knew there was something special about you, sir. From the first day I started working in your house, I felt that there was a connection I couldn't explain." "Constance, there's something else I need to tell you." "What is it, sir?" "My grandmother's name was Isabel Castle. You named your daughter after my grandmother." Constance was silent for a few seconds. "Joseph Charles chose the name. He said Isabella was a strong name, the name of an important woman. Now I understand why." At that moment, they heard Isabella's voice calling for her mother. Constance went back into the room, followed by Richard Henry. The girl was awake and seemed curious about the conversation she had overheard in the hallway. "Mummy, were you talking about family?" Constance looked at Richard Henry, silently asking for permission to tell the truth. "You can tell her," he said. Constance sat on the edge of the bed and held her daughter's hand. "Isabella, my love, we found out something very important. Remember how Daddy always said he wanted to meet his family?" "I remember. Well, we found out that Daddy did have a family, and that now we have a family too." Isabella looked at Richard Henry with interest. "Is Mommy's important man part of our family?" "He is, my love. He's Daddy's cousin. That makes him our cousin too." Isabella smiled, the first genuine smile Richard Henry had seen on her face since he met her. "So you're my cousin, Uncle?" The word uncle sounded strange and wonderful in Richard Henry's ears. At 53, he was discovering he had a family he never knew existed. "I am, Isabella. I'm your cousin. And you're going to help me get better?" "I am. In fact, I'm going to give you a little piece of me so you can get well." "What do you mean?" Constance explained to her daughter in simple terms what a bone marrow transplant was and how Richard Henry was going to help her get better. "Will it hurt?" Isabella asked. "A little bit," Richard Henry admitted, "but it will be worth it, because you're going to be completely cured." "And after I get better, will you still be our cousin?" The childish question touched Richard Henry in a way he hadn't expected. "Always. Forever." In the following hours, Richard Henry underwent a battery of preoperative exams: EKG, blood tests, chest X-ray, psychological evaluation, all to ensure he was fit for the bone marrow donation procedure. Meanwhile, he began to organize practical matters that needed to be addressed. He called his lawyers and instructed them to create a trust fund in Isabella Smith's name, with sufficient funds to guarantee her education, health, and well-being into adulthood. He also instructed them to purchase an apartment in a better New York neighborhood for Constance and Isabella to live in. "Sir," said Valerie, his assistant, when he called to give these instructions, "may I ask what's happening? Since yesterday you've been telling me it's a family emergency, but you don't have any close family." "I do now, Valerie. I do now." Late that afternoon, Dr. Steinberg called Richard Henry for one last conversation before scheduling the surgery. "Mr. Castle, all your preoperative tests are perfect. We can schedule the donation for the day after tomorrow, on Thursday morning. How does the procedure work?" "It's a relatively simple surgery. We make small punctures in your hip bone and extract the bone marrow with special needles. You'll be in the hospital for a day, maybe two. The extracted marrow is processed and infused into Isabella a few hours later." "And the risks?" "For you, minimal. You might have some pain at the extraction site for a few days, but nothing serious. For Isabella, the risk is greater, because before she receives the new marrow, we need to completely destroy her immune system. It's a critical period of about 2 weeks where she will be extremely vulnerable. But the chances of success, with the compatibility you have, an 85% chance of a complete cure." Richard Henry didn't hesitate. "Then let's do it." That night he called Helena, his ex-wife, who lived in Paris. It was a conversation he felt he needed to have. "Helena, it's Richard. I know it's late, but I needed to talk to you." "Richard, is everything all right? You sound different." "I am different. I found out I have family. A 9-year-old cousin with a serious illness. I'm having surgery to help her." Helena was silent for a few seconds. "A cousin? What do you mean?" Richard Henry quickly explained the entire situation, from Constance's call to the discovery of their family ties. "My God, Richard, that's incredible. And you're going to donate bone marrow?" "I am. It's the only chance she has." "Are you sure about this? You were never a person. How can I put this? Family was never a priority for you. Maybe because I never had a real family, but I do now, and I'm not going to abandon them." After the call, Richard Henry returned to Isabella's room. Constance was sleeping in the armchair, exhausted by the events of the past few days. Isabella was awake, looking out the window of her room. "Can't sleep?" he asked quietly. "I'm thinking." "Thinking about what?" "If Daddy knew he had family, if he'd be happy to know that now I have a cousin who's going to help me. Richard Henry sat in the chair next to the bed. I'm sure he would be very happy, Isabella. Cousin Richard? Yes? Thank you. For what? For taking care of us. Mommy cried a lot these past few days, but now she's smiling again. Richard Henry looked at the sleeping Constance. It was true, even in her sleep she seemed more peaceful than she had in days. Isabella, can I ask you a question? You can. Are you scared of the surgery? The girl thought for a few seconds before answering. A little. But Mommy always said that when you have real family, you don't have to be afraid of anything. That night, for the first time in many years, Richard Henry Castle fell asleep with the feeling that his life finally had a purpose that went beyond profits and business achievements. In 2 days, he would give a piece of himself to save the life of a girl who had become, in a matter of hours, the most important person in his existence. Thursday dawned rainy in New York City, but inside Mount Sinai Hospital there was an atmosphere of controlled hope that contrasted with the grey weather outside. Richard Henry arrived at the hospital at 6 in the morning, 2 hours before his scheduled surgery. He hadn't been able to sleep well during the night, not out of fear, but from a positive anxiety he hadn't experienced in decades. Constance and Isabella had been at the hospital since the previous day, as the girl needed to start a specific protocol to prepare for receiving the new bone marrow. It was a delicate and dangerous process. First, the doctors would completely destroy Isabella's immune system with chemotherapy and radiation, leaving her utterly vulnerable. Only then would she receive the marrow donated by Richard Henry, which would theoretically rebuild her natural defenses. It's like demolishing an old house to build a new one on the same plot of land, Dr. Steinberg explained during the preoperative meeting. For a few days, Isabella will have no defenses whatsoever against any kind of infection. It's the most dangerous part of the entire treatment. Richard Henry met with them in Isabella's room before heading to surgical prep. The girl was paler than in previous days, an effect of the preparatory medication, but her eyes still shone with a determination that was impressive for someone just 9 years old. "Cousin Richard, are you ready?" she asked, trying to sound brave. "I am, little one. And you?" "I am too. Mommy explained that after today I'll be sick for a little while, but then I'll be stronger than ever." Constance, sitting on the edge of the bed holding her daughter's hand, looked at Richard Henry with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "Sir, Cousin Richard," she corrected herself, still not used to the new family intimacy. "I don't even know how to begin to thank you." "Constance, you don't need to thank me. This is what family does. But I know this is a lot for you. Your whole life has changed in 3 days because of us." Richard Henry approached and for the first time hugged Constance. It was a sincere embrace, charged with all the emotion of the past few days. "My life has changed for the better, Constance. For the first time in 53 years I know what my purpose in the world is." The bone marrow extraction procedure was scheduled for 8 in the morning. Richard Henry was taken to the operating room, where he met the entire medical team that would participate. Dr. Steinberg, the anesthesiologist Dr. Charles Fernandez, the head nurse Marina Alves, and 3 more hematology specialists who would oversee the entire procedure. "Mr. Castle," said Dr. Fernandez, "we'll be using general anesthesia for the procedure. Do you have any questions about what's going to happen?" "None. I just want to know how long it takes." "Between 2 and 3 hours to extract the necessary amount of marrow. It's a meticulous process because we need to extract high-quality cells." "And afterward, you'll be in the recovery room for a few hours, and if all goes well, you can be discharged tomorrow morning." "And Isabella?" "The marrow will be processed in the lab and infused into her a few hours after the extraction. It's like a blood transfusion, but with much more special cells." Before being taken into the operating room, Richard Henry made a point of quickly speaking with Dr. Steinberg about a decision he had made during the night. "Doctor, I want to watch Isabella's procedure after my surgery. Sir, you'll be recovering from anesthesia." "Doctor, I've spent my entire life making important decisions for others. This is the most important decision I've ever made for myself. I want to be conscious when my marrow is infused into Isabella." The doctor hesitated, but understood the importance of that moment for the businessman. "Very well. We'll use a local anesthetic combined with light sedation. You'll feel some discomfort, but you can be awake if you wish." The surgery began promptly at 8 o'clock. Richard Henry was lying on his stomach, with the hip area, anesthetized. He could feel the movement of the medical team, hear the technical conversations, and strangely, he felt at peace. For the first time in many years, he wasn't worried about meetings, calls, or business decisions. His only concern was that this procedure would succeed and save Isabella's life. "Mr. Castle, we're starting the first extraction," Dr. Steinberg informed him. "You'll feel pressure, but no pain." Richard Henry closed his eyes and thought of his grandfather Henry, who had died without knowing he had left a son in Pennsylvania. He thought of Joseph Charles, who had grown up without knowing his father and died young without knowing he had family. And he thought of Isabella, who was just a few feet away, entirely dependent on the marrow being extracted from his body. "First sample collected," one of the nurses announced. "Excellent quality." The procedure lasted for 2 hours and 40 minutes. During that entire time, Richard Henry remained conscious, occasionally talking with the medical team about the process. It was the most intense and meaningful experience of his life. "Completed," Dr. Steinberg finally said. "We've collected more than enough and the quality of the cells is exceptional." Richard Henry was taken to a special recovery room where he could rest, but still monitor what was happening with Isabella. A nurse brought a special phone connected to the lab, through which he could follow the processing of his bone marrow. "Mr. Castle," said the voice of the biologist in charge of the lab, "your cells are being prepared now. We'll separate the most important components and concentrate them for the infusion. It should take about 2 hours." While he waited, Constance came to visit him in the recovery room. "How are you feeling?" "Fine, a little sore but fine. And Isabella?" "She's being brave. She asked if she could send you a kiss through the bone marrow." Richard Henry smiled, despite the pain that was beginning to set in around his hip. "Tell her I'll send all my love along with the cells." Around 2 in the afternoon, everything was ready for the infusion of the bone marrow into Isabella. Richard Henry, against all hospital protocols, but with special permission from Dr. Steinberg, was taken in a wheelchair to a room adjacent to the ICU, from where he could watch the procedure through a special glass window. Isabella was lying in bed with several catheters connected to her small chest. She looked even more fragile than in previous days, because the chemotherapy had completely wiped out her natural defenses. She was wearing a special mask, and the entire environment around her was sterile. Dr. Steinberg approached her with a transparent bag containing a reddish liquid, Richard Henry's bone marrow, processed and ready to save her life. "Isabella, are you ready?" the doctor asked. "I am, doctor. And is Cousin Richard watching?" Dr. Steinberg pointed to the glass where Richard Henry waved at her. Isabella waved back, her eyes smiling above the mask. "So you can start, doctor," she said with impressive maturity. The infusion began slowly. The reddish liquid flowed down the catheter, entering Isabella's bloodstream. It was a simple process in appearance, but Richard Henry knew he was witnessing a miracle of modern medicine. His cells were entering the girl's body, and over the next few weeks would settle in her bone marrow and begin to produce a completely new immune system. "It's like planting seeds," Dr. Steinberg explained over the intercom. "Your cells will find their way to Isabella's bone marrow and start to grow there. In a few weeks, her body will be producing its own defenses." The process lasted about an hour. During that entire time, Isabella remained calm and brave, talking softly with her mother and occasionally waving to Richard Henry through the glass. When the last drop of bone marrow was infused, Dr. Steinberg approached Isabella for a final check. "How do you feel, little one?" "Normal," she replied. "When will I start to get better?" "Your cousin's cells will need a few weeks to settle properly in your body. During that time, you'll stay here at the hospital to make sure everything goes well." "And then I can go home?" "Then you can go home completely cured." That night, Richard Henry stayed at the hospital, despite the doctors insisting he could go home to recover. He wanted to be close to Isabella during the critical first few days post-transplant. "Sir," said Constance, coming to talk to him in the waiting room, "you should go rest at home. You've done so much for us, but now you need to take care of yourself." "Constance, do you understand that as of today, we are a real family? It's not just a genetic matter, it's a choice I choose to take care of you, and I hope you'll let me be a part of your lives." Constance began to cry, tears of emotion, not sadness. "Of course, Cousin Richard, of course we want you in our family." Over the next 3 days, Isabella went through the most critical period of the post-transplant recovery. Her immune system was completely gone, and any infection, no matter how minor, could be fatal. Richard Henry remained at the hospital throughout this period, working by phone when necessary, but always available if Constance or Isabella needed anything. On the 3rd day after the transplant, Isabella developed a high fever that alarmed the entire medical team. "Her temperature has risen to 102 degrees, Dr. Steinberg reported. "It could be a normal reaction to the transplant, but it could also be an infection. We're starting preventative antibiotics immediately." Constance was distraught, and Richard Henry spent the entire night by her side, offering all the emotional support he could. "What if it doesn't work?" she asked during the night. "What if my daughter dies after all this?" "She won't die, Constance. Isabella is strong, and the cells we gave her are strong too. She will get through this." On the morning of the 4th day, Isabella's fever began to break, and by the 5th day she was back to playing in bed, chatting animatedly with the nurses and asking when she could have pizza again. The fever was a normal reaction, Dr. Steinberg explained, visibly relieved. Her body was getting used to the new immune system. From now on, the prognosis is very positive. A week after the transplant, the first follow-up tests showed that Richard Henry's cells were settling perfectly into Isabella's bone marrow. 2 weeks later, she was already producing her own defense cells for the first time in her life. "It's a miracle," said Constance, holding the test results. "My daughter is going to have a normal life." "More than normal," Dr. Steinberg corrected. "With her new immune system, she'll be more resistant to illnesses than most children." During these weeks of recovery, Richard Henry and Constance spent a lot of time together, talking about the past, the present, and the future. She told stories about Joseph Charles and the difficult life they had led. He spoke about his privileged but lonely childhood, about the years spent building a business empire, and about how empty he felt despite all his success. "You know, Constance, I always thought family was a distraction, something that got in the way of business. Now I realize that business was the distraction from life's true purpose." "And what is the true purpose, cousin?" "To care for the people we love, to be important in someone's life not because we have money or power, but because we choose to be present." 3 weeks after the transplant, Isabella was discharged from the hospital. She would still need regular medical follow-ups for a few months, but she was officially cured of her immunodeficiency. On the day of her discharge, Richard Henry was arranging the family's move to the new apartment he had bought for them on the Upper East Side, a much better neighborhood than the Bronx, close to good schools and hospitals. "Cousin Richard," Isabella said as they packed her things, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, little one." "Why did you never get married again? Why did you never have children?" It was an innocent question, but it touched on a sensitive point. "You know, Isabella, I always thought family was too complicated, that I didn't know how to take care of other people. And now? Now I know that family isn't complicated when it's based on true love. So now you'll want to have more family." Richard Henry looked at Constance and Isabella, and for the first time in his life, he knew exactly what the answer was. "I already have the family I always wanted, the two of you." That afternoon, when they left Mount Sinai Hospital, Richard Henry carried Isabella in his arms to the car while Constance walked beside him. To anyone who saw them, they looked exactly like what they had become: a family. 6 months. After the transplant on a sunny September morning, Richard Henry woke to the sound of laughter coming from the kitchen of his apartment. It was no longer the cold, silent penthouse in the Park Avenue Tower where he had lived alone for so many years. 2 months after Isabella's discharge, he had sold that space and bought a cozy apartment on the Upper East Side with 3 bedrooms, a large living room, and a kitchen big enough for 3 people to make breakfast together. Constance and Isabella had moved in at his invitation, not as an employee and her daughter, but as family. At first, Constance hesitated to accept such generosity, but Richard Henry was insistent. They were a real family now, and families lived together. "Cousin Richard, you're late," Isabella shouted from the kitchen. "Mommy has already made breakfast and you're not even up yet." Richard Henry smiled, putting on a simple robe, a far cry from the impeccable suits he had worn for decades. His hair was messier, his face less tense, and there was a lightness to his movements that hadn't existed before he met Constance and Isabella. In the kitchen he found the scene that repeated itself every morning and never failed to move him. Constance preparing breakfast, humming a country song she had learned in her childhood in Pennsylvania, and Isabella sitting at the table doing homework from her new school, one of the best private schools in New York, but where she was treated like any other child with no special privileges. "Good morning, family," he said, kissing Isabella's forehead and hugging Constance from behind as she stirred eggs in the skillet. "Good morning, cousin," Isabella replied without taking her eyes off her notebook. "You remember today is the presentation at school, right?" "How could—" "I forget. You're presenting the project on family, aren't you?" "That's right, and you're going to be there." "Of course I'll be there." This was another major change in Richard Henry's life. Over the past 6 months, he had learned to delegate much more responsibility to his vice presidents, reducing his workload so he could be present for the important moments in Isabella's life. School presentations, routine doctor's appointments, friends' birthday parties, all of these had become priorities on his schedule. "And what are you going to talk about in your presentation?" Constance asked. "I'm going to tell how our family was formed, how Cousin Richard found out we were relatives and how he saved my life." "Are you sure you want to tell the whole story?" Richard Henry asked, concerned. "It's a very personal story. Cousin, the teacher asked us to talk about different kinds of families, and our family is special because it didn't start at the beginning, it started in the middle." The way Isabella saw the world never ceased to amaze Richard Henry. At 10, she had celebrated her birthday the month before. With a party Richard Henry organized himself. She had an emotional wisdom that many adults lacked. After breakfast, the three of them left together. Richard Henry would drop Isabella off at school before heading to the office, and Constance would go to the nursing college, where she had enrolled 3 months earlier. One of the first things Richard Henry had done after Isabella's recovery was to convince Constance to go back to school. She had been a nurse's aide in Pennsylvania, but had never finished her degree. Now, at 45, she was fulfilling her dream of becoming a registered nurse. "Sir, Cousin Richard," Constance would say. She still corrected herself sometimes, especially when she was nervous. "I still can't believe I'm able to study again." "You were always smart, Constance. You just never had the opportunity to show it. If someone had told me a year ago that I'd be studying nursing at a private college in New York, I would have said they were crazy. If someone had told me a year ago that I'd be taking my cousin to school every morning, I would have thought it was crazy too," Richard Henry laughed. On the way to Isabella's school, Richard Henry reflected on all the changes that had happened in his life. His company was still thriving. In fact, it was doing better than ever because he had learned to trust his team more. But business success was no longer his sole measure of happiness. Now he measured the quality of his days by the amount of time he spent with Constance and Isabella, by the smiles he saw on their faces, by the small victories of daily life. The first A Isabella got at her new school. The first day Constance came home from college, excitedly talking about an anatomy class. The first time Isabella accidentally called him Dad and then apologized, but he told her she didn't need to. At the school, Richard Henry greeted some of the mothers and fathers he now knew. At first, there had been a certain awkwardness. Everyone knew who he was, and some wondered what a business magnate was doing taking a child to school every morning. But over time, especially after the story of the transplant discreetly leaked, he came to be respected not for his money, but for his dedication to his family. "Mr. Castle," said the school principal, Mrs. Anne Louise, approaching him in the courtyard, "may I have a word with you?" "Of course. It's about Isabella's presentation this afternoon. She told her teacher she's going to talk about your family's story. I wanted to know if you approve of the content." Mrs. Louise, Isabella can talk about anything she wants. Our story is no secret. It's a very beautiful story, sir, and very inspiring for the other children. It's a story that completely changed my life. After dropping Isabella off, Richard Henry headed to his office in Midtown Manhattan. Another change. He had sold the entire Park Avenue Tower and rented a smaller, more functional and less ostentatious office. He had discovered he didn't need 40 floors to prove his importance in the business world. At the office, he was greeted by Valerie, his assistant, who had adapted surprisingly well to her boss's new work routine. "Good morning, Mr. Castle. I have you down for the meeting with the Japanese investors at 9, the video conference with Miami at noon, and you need to leave at 2 for Isabella's presentation." "Perfect, Valerie. And how are the numbers for the foundation?" The Isabella Castle Foundation had been established 3 months after the transplant. It was a non-profit organization dedicated to helping low-income families with children suffering from rare diseases. In 6 months of operation, it had already funded the treatment of 17 children and created a database to facilitate finding bone marrow donors. "The numbers are excellent, sir. This month we've helped 3 more families, and we have a waiting list of volunteer donors that has grown by 40%. Working with the foundation had become one of the most rewarding activities in Richard Henry's life. It was the first time he saw his money generating results. He could directly touch and feel. Every child cured, every family reunited, every donor found was a personal victory worth more than any business profit. The morning passed quickly between meetings and conferences. Richard Henry had learned to be more efficient, resolving in 4 hours of focused work what used to take 12 hours of exhausting days. At 2 o'clock sharp, he was back at Isabella's school for the presentation. Constance arrived a few minutes later, straight from college, still carrying her anatomy books. "How was class?" he asked. "Wonderful. Today we learned about the circulatory system. It made me think about how blood carries life throughout the body, just like your bone marrow brought new life to our Isabella." The classroom was filled with parents eager to hear the presentations on family. Isabella was the 5th child to present, and Richard Henry could see she was nervous but determined. When her turn came, Isabella walked to the front of the room with a confidence that impressed everyone. "My name is Isabella Smith, and I want to talk about how our family is special," she began, her voice clear and steady. "Most families start when people are born or get married. Our family started with a phone call in the middle of the night." She told the whole story. The mysterious illness, the hospital, the discovery that Richard Henry was her cousin, the bone marrow transplant, and how they decided to live together as a real family. "Before, we were 3 lonely people," she said. "My mom was lonely because my dad died. I was lonely because I was sick and couldn't play with other kids. And my cousin Richard was lonely because he worked so much he didn't have time for family. Now we're a real family because we chose to take care of each other." When she finished her presentation, there was an emotional silence in the room, followed by an enthusiastic round of applause. Several mothers were wiping away tears, and Richard Henry felt a pride so intense he thought his chest would burst. After the presentations, during the potluck snack time, several families approached them to talk. "Mr. Castle," said one of the mothers, "what an inspiring story. You are an example that family truly is a choice." "It's true," Richard Henry replied, putting his arm around Constance and Isabella's shoulders. "And it was the best choice I ever made in my life." On the way home, Isabella was euphoric about the success of her presentation. "Cousin Richard, did you see how emotional everyone got?" "I did. You spoke very well. And you weren't embarrassed that I told our whole story." "On the contrary, little one, I was proud. Our story is beautiful and other people can be inspired by it." That night after dinner, the 3 of them gathered in the living room to watch a movie. Another ritual they had developed. Richard Henry was lying on the sofa, with Isabella nestled in one of his arms and Constance in the other. It was a scene of family intimacy he had never imagined experiencing. "Cousin Richard," Isabella said suddenly, "can I ask you a question?" "Of course." "Do you regret changing your whole life for us?" It was a profound question for a 10-year-old, but Richard Henry knew exactly how to answer. "Isabella, I didn't change my life because of you. You helped me find the life I was always supposed to live. What do you mean? For 53 years I lived a life that seemed important, but was empty on the inside. I had money, success, power, but I had no one to truly love. Now I have a family, I have a purpose, I have love. This is the first time in my life that I'm truly alive. Constance squeezed his hand. We're alive for the first time too, cousin. For the first time, we're not afraid of the future. When Isabella fell asleep on the sofa, Richard Henry carried her to her room. It was a room decorated with care, full of books, educational toys, and drawings she had made depicting their family. On the wall was a frame with the first official photo of the three of them, taken the day she was discharged from the hospital. After putting Isabella to bed, Richard Henry and Constance returned to the living room and sat on the balcony, watching the lights of New York City glittering in the night. Constance, can I ask you a question? Of course. Do you think Joseph Charles would be happy to know that Isabella found a family? Constance smiled, looking up at the stars. I'm sure he would. Joseph Charles always said that family was the most important thing in the world. He would be so happy to know his daughter has a cousin who loves her like a father. And you, are you happy with this new life? Cousin Richard, I spent 7 years struggling alone, working as a cleaner to support my daughter, always afraid of what might happen in the future. Now I'm studying nursing. My daughter is cured and has a future, and I have a family. How could I not be happy? They sat in silence for a few minutes, simply enjoying the tranquility of the night and the sense of completeness they all felt. You know what's most incredible about this whole story, said Richard Henry. What? That it started with a call I almost didn't answer if I had ignored that phone that night. But you answered, and you changed 3 lives forever. Actually, it changed 4 lives. How so? Mine, yours, Isabella's, and Joseph Charles's. Because now he has a family taking care of the daughter he loved so much. In a way, he's not alone anymore either. When they went to bed that night, Richard Henry paused at Isabella's doorway to take one last look at the girl. She was sleeping soundly, breathing easily, something that had been impossible for the first 9 years of her life. Her face was serene, and even in the dark he could see the faint smile she held even in sleep. In the next room, Constance was getting ready for bed, organizing the nursing book she would study the next day. She had transformed from a woman haunted by poverty and her daughter's illness into a confident woman, studying to achieve a dream she thought she had lost forever. And he himself. Richard Henry Castle had transformed from a cold, solitary businessman into a man who knew what it meant to love and be loved unconditionally. The next morning, like every day for the past 6 months, he woke to the sound of laughter coming from the kitchen, and like every day he smiled before he even fully opened his eyes, knowing that his family was there, healthy and happy, waiting to start another day together. The story that had begun with a desperate call at 10:30 at night had turned into the most beautiful story he could ever have imagined living. 3 years later, Richard Henry was in the backyard of the new house they had bought in a family-oriented community in Greenwich, Connecticut, pushing Isabella on the swing he had installed himself. Constance had graduated as a nurse and now worked at Mount Sinai Hospital in the same department where her daughter had been cured. The Isabella Castle Foundation had helped over 200 families, and Richard Henry had discovered that the true measure of success wasn't in his company's numbers, but in the smiles of the people he loved. "Hiya, Dad," Isabella shouted from the swing. She had started calling him Dad naturally, and he never corrected her. "It's already very high, little one." "No, it's not. I want to reach the clouds." And as he pushed the swing, making his daughter, because that's what she had become, laugh with joy, Richard. Henry thought that maybe she had already reached the clouds. They all had on that March night, when one phone call forever changed the destiny of 3 people who loved each other without knowing they were family.